Hello, junkies. Welcome to Nocturnal Throwback episode number 23, the podcast where we re-podcast the original first draft of Nocturnal, which we originally released in 2007. Oh, snap, Becky, we have a new sponsor. In the time of COVIDs, grocery stores can be a real minefield. Masks, viruses, coughing Karens, angry Chads. Why not mitigate your exposure to these vile creatures and make something fantastic for your face and the faces of those you love? Let's talk about Green Chef. Green Chef is a meal delivery service that lets you choose from a wide variety of easy-to-follow lifestyles with select organic ingredients. Everything is handpicked, as fresh as DJ Jazzy Jeff, and delivered right to your door. You do the cooking. Recipes are quick and easy, with step-by-step instructions, chef tips, and photos to guide you along. Green Chef is a USDA-certified organic company with meal plans that include paleo, plant-powered, keto, and balanced living. We've actually been using Green Chef this week here at Empty Set Entertainment, and playa, the food is lip-smackingly delicious. I put it in my mouth, and lo, it was good. Use the code SIGLER80, that's SIGLER80, to get $80 off your first month, plus free shipping on your first box. Go to greenchef.com/Sigler80 to redeem and for more details. That's greenchef.com/Sigler80. Now, let's do the time warp again. Here comes the talkie talk from the original 2007 Nocturnal episode, and then some juicy story. And by juicy, I mean rare. And by rare, I mean bloody. Enjoy.
The future Dark Overlord is back from LA, Seattle, San Francisco, New York, and Houston, and ready for Nocturnal, episode 23. Nocturnal is a podcast-only novel you can't buy in stores and you can't peek at the end. Written and performed by Scott Sigler. More information and more free stories available at scottsigler.com. This book contains adult language, mature situations, and lots of violence. Hello, my junkies. I am back from what was the most phenomenal book tour I've ever been on. It's the first book tour I've ever been on, but still the most phenomenal. And as such, I've been traveling almost nonstop for the past week and a half. I have had very little time to do anything, but I made time to get you guys 25 fat minutes of story. And I'm running so late, no story so far, no jibber jab at the beginning, no jibber jab at the end. We're just going to roll right into Nocturnal 23. Later on this week, I'll get you all caught up on the book tour and all the other cool news that's going on. But for now, let's rock the Nocturnal. The heart monitor beeped out a steady monotone. Slow, but steady. Chief Amy Zoe looked down at Jebediah Erikson. Wrists handcuffed to the bed frame. Thick canvas straps tight across his chest. Under the yellow blanket, the same straps would be around his ankles, his thighs. He looked so much older than the last time she'd seen him. Well, of course. That had been, 25 years earlier? No, 30. At the very beginning of her career, going into that insane asylum with Francis Parkmeyer. She'd been a snot-nosed detective rookie back then, but she'd also been the one to put the pieces together, to connect the silver arrowheads, link them to Erikson through Alder Jessup. Of course Erikson looked older now, because it was 30 years later. And back then, he wasn't some old man in a hospital bed, bandaged, loaded with tubes leading to his nose and his arm. Back then, he'd been death personified. Just looking at his eyes made her cross herself. But he didn't look like that anymore. Now, he just looked old. Old and scarred. Scars covered his arms, his neck, his chest. Nasty scars, too. Long, curving things that must have required hundreds of stitches. This man was a warrior, and the scars told the story of his battles. "God damn it, Bryan," she mumbled. "You don't know what you've done." She should have fired him. Hell, arrested him even, thrown him in a cell until she could map it out for him. How could she blame him? He'd done exactly the same thing she had done some 30 years earlier. She'd been told to leave it alone too, but she hadn't. She couldn't. The law was the law, and back then, she'd be damned if she'd give a killer a free ride. And how many people had died from her stubbornness? More importantly, how many people would die now because of Bryan's? Her cell phone rang. Oh, Christ. What now? Chief So here.
Chief, we got a big problem.
I know, Sean, and I told you to handle it until I could get there.
No, Chief, I'm not talking about that. We just had a mob shootout in North Beach. Someone made a move on Frank Lanza. A big move. La Rocca's Corner Tavern. 7 dead. SFFD is putting out the fire now. Roadblocks are set up on Columbus. It's real bad, Chief.
Amy closed her eyes. She took a deep breath. Sometimes this job got to be too much. A fucking mob war in downtown San Francisco. Erikson hurt. Bryan and Pookie on the loose, tearing up shit all over the place because they couldn't just trust her.
Chief, you there?
I'm here. She couldn't dwell on it. She couldn't give in to the stress. She was the chief of police, and it was her job to handle things just like this. I'm on my way. I'm going to have to be on scene for a long time on this, Sean, so you handle everything else. You got it?
Got it.
And seal up Erikson's house. No one goes in.
But, Chief, I did like you said, no one has gone inside yet. There could still be wounded in there.
Seal it off! Amy screamed, then caught herself, controlled her volume. I don't have time for people to go against my orders anymore, Sean. Do you got that?
Yeah, yes, ma'am. I'm just looking out for people.
Amy closed her eyes again. Sean was a good man. More than likely, he'd be the next chief of police of San Francisco. But for now, she didn't need him to be good. She needed him to do what she said. Sean, I'm not going to go into this again. Seal up the fucking house. Anyone goes in for any reason and you are out of a job. I need you free to handle anything else that comes up while I'm handling the Lanza situation. Now tell me you understand.
I understand.
You're sure? You get what I'm saying here, Sean, that there is no gray area. There is no thinking on your feet. You lock that house down, and that is that.
Yes, Chief. I get it.
She hung up. Sean wasn't like Bryan, wasn't like Pookie. For that matter, he wasn't like her. He'd obey orders. She'd get to Erikson's house when she could. She gently held Erikson's hand and gave it a soft squeeze. Get well, she whispered. We need you. She walked out of the hospital room. The uniformed officer guarding the door stood up from his chair. He snapped to attention, but she was walking so fast she was already 5 steps away, and she didn't see it. Sub-Chief Sean Robertson closed his cell phone and just stood there. He was in charge. Gangland shootouts didn't happen every day in San Francisco, and when they did, it was usually a couple of gangbanging brothers down in Hunters Point, not 7 people in a burning bar in downtown San Francisco proper. Where a couple of dead blacks in Hunters Point would merit maybe a small story on the bottom of the front page of the Chronicle, 6 dead white men and 1 dead white woman would be played huge above the fold. This would be a media circus. Chief So would be fully occupied for the next 8 hours at least. Everything was falling apart. Lanza was probably alive. Sean needed to check in and get this situation sealed up. Bryan Clauser and Pookie Chang were the problem. They were too close to figuring it all out if they hadn't already. It was time to take them out of the picture. Patrolman Jason Green watched Chief So walk down the hall, then get into the elevator. After the elevator doors shut, he watched some more. He had to make sure she wasn't coming back. He breathed slowly and counted to 20. 1 1,000. 2 1,000. Jason looked up and down the hospital hall. No one there. He pulled out his cell phone, opened it, and dialed. Eyes still flicking up and down the hall, he felt like Chief Zoe would magically pop up at any second, and he'd have to look into her angry eyes. He was a grown man, a police officer. He carried a gun, for crying out loud. But Chief Zoe still made him feel like he was 6 years old and in trouble with his mother. The phone on the other end answered.
Jake!
Pookie Chang said.
How are you, big man?
I'm good, Pooks. I'm good.
And that molar, did they extract that crack sucker?
Yeah, your dentist worked out great. Thanks for that. Hey, Pooks, she's gone. If you want to see Erikson, now's the time.
Got it. I'll be there in a snort and a half. Hey, did your brother-in-law get into med school?
Yeah, Jason said. He did. When did I tell you about that?
4 weeks ago, at the precinct softball game.
Jason nodded and smiled. He didn't even remember the conversation. Well, get here fast, Jason said. I don't know when she's coming back.
I'm out like a trout, Jake, and thanks.
Pookie hung up. Jason quickly folded the phone and put it back in his pants pocket, then stood straight and tall. His eyes still flicked back to the elevator, hoping Chief Zoe wouldn't come back. Pookie sounded a little scratchy, the result of a bad cell phone connection.
You got a boogie if you want to see him, Bri.
Is he awake yet?
He's woke up once, but only for a few seconds.
Pookie said.
I just got here, man. You need to come now. I don't know how long we'll have. Hey, you hear about that hit attempt on Lanza?
Yeah, Bryan said. I heard it on the scanner.
Where are you at, Jack?
I'm just coming back up into the city now.
What did the taxidermist say?
Bryan's phone beeped twice for call waiting. He looked at the screen. Sub-Chief Sean Robertson. Pooks, I gotta go. That's Robertson. I'll be there in like 15 minutes, and I'll tell you all about the taxidermist, dig?
Dig!
Bryan hung up on Pookie and answered the other call. Hello, Sub-Chief. Bryan here.
Clauser, I need to see you immediately.
I'm on my way to meet a source.
Now, Detective. Right now. You got that?
Bryan sighed. He should have ignored the call, but it was too late now. Yes, sir.
Good. Where are you?
Coming up 101 North.
Yeah, just take 280 to the ballpark. I'll be on 2nd Street, right after the park.
You don't want to meet at the station?
I thought you said you had to meet a source.
Robertson said. Yeah. Okay, 2nd Street. I'll be there in like 10 minutes. Aggie followed Hillary. He didn't know how long they'd been walking through the cramped tunnel. She held a green Coleman lantern that filled the tunnel with battery-powered light. She seemed to know the location of every rock, every turn, every jagged outcropping of rusted metal or molding wood. He knew this because these things caught him, poked him, snagged him, and none of them touched her even though she walked in front of him. He cradled the knit purse in his right arm. The baby slept inside. He could feel its faint warmth through the bag and through his pajamas. Tiny little thing. It weighed almost nothing. Aggie could carry him forever if he had to. Finally, Hillary stopped and turned.
Move carefully here, she said. You step where I step.
She set the lantern on the ground and stepped aside so Aggie could see a small forest of about 15 piles of stacked rocks. No, not piles. Columns. The rocks supported big slabs of concrete, or chunks of old brick wall, or blackened pieces of timber. Together, the ceiling was about 3 feet wide, running the final 15 feet of tunnel, right up to where it dead-ended at a giant dirty sheet of plywood. It didn't take a genius to see the plan. Bump any column of rocks, make it fall, and the whole kit and caboodle would tumble down, filling the tunnel with tons of dirt and rock. It would most certainly kill him. If the falling concrete and/or bricks didn't take him out, he'd be buried and die in the dark. Hillary gestured to the ceiling.
You understand,
she said. Aggie nodded. Hillary picked up the lantern and slid around the first column. Finally standing still, Aggie got a chance to just watch her. She looked like an old lady, but didn't move like one. She had agility and balance to complement the ridiculous strength he already knew she possessed. Where she stepped, she wiggled her foot flat on the ground. When she took her next step, he could see that footprint clearly. She'd marked him a safe path. She slid around the second column, then waved him on. Holding the baby to his chest, Aggie followed in Hillary's footsteps. He took his time. She didn't seem to mind. It didn't take long with her blazing the trail, and within 2 minutes, he had carefully passed by all the columns save for one. The last column sat dead center in the middle of the 3-foot-wide tunnel, only 2 inches behind the sheet of plywood that blocked the way. Hillary grabbed the sheet and carefully slid it into a narrow slot cut into the dirt on the left side of the tunnel. She moved slow, cautiously, because a cave-in would probably kill her as well. She slid the plywood aside to reveal a narrow hole, maybe 2 feet wide, and a deep blackness beyond. Aggie felt the tender kiss of something he hadn't known for days. A breeze. Fresh air. Well, not fresh. It smelled of metal and grease, but it was far fresher than the still air he'd breathed since he woke up in the white dungeon. He heard a rumbling. Something big, something mechanical, something getting closer. Hillary held up a hand, palm out. The gesture said, "Stay there, don't move." Aggie froze in place. He was so close. Hillary turned off the Coleman, leaving a blackness that made the walls close in. The sound grew louder and the tunnel rumbled. He looked up anxiously at the hodgepodge death trap ceiling. He expected to see bits of rock fall, trailing powdery columns of dirt, but the ceiling didn't budge. Suddenly, there was a flash of light and the roar of metal wheels on metal tracks. A Muni train. He was in the San Francisco subway. Aggie tried to calm his breathing. Hope flared to its highest levels yet. Hillary was doing it. She was letting him out. The Muni train passed, its roar a fading echo.
"Now you go,"
Hillary said. She pointed to the baby.
"Do you remember what I told you?"
Aggie nodded. She was letting him out. She was giving him life. No matter how fucked up things had been, no matter what he'd seen, he would keep his word. No way in fuck he was going to wind up a groom. No way. Whatever it took. Hillary smiled, showing her missing teeth. She knew that Aggie would keep his word. At that moment, Aggie knew she had done this before, perhaps many times. Hillary knew how to control people, and she believed Aggie would fulfill her mission. If she didn't, he knew she would have killed him right on the spot. He handed her the baby, then carefully stepped through the small hole and out of the death trap tunnel. Once through, he stood in the narrow space to the right of the tracks, then reached back for the baby. Feeling its tiny weight through the knit purse, Aggie felt a striking pang of anxiety. He should have never let go of the baby at all. What if Hillary had decided to take the baby away from him at the last second? Aggie James clutched the tiny thing to his chest, the sense of imagined dread clinging to his soul. Down the tunnel, he could see light. He wondered which station it was. Hillary slid the plywood shut behind him. Once shut, the tunnel again filled mostly with darkness, and Aggie could see the simple brilliance of the exit. In the dark, it was barely visible. A simple space in the tiles, a space backed by dirty black plywood. In the light of day, it would look conspicuous, but down here, it didn't look like anything. In fact, he saw several other various-sized holes in the tile, all filled with plywood. He wondered if those had happened on their own, or if Hillary's people had made them so that their own exit wouldn't stand out. And if someone did push in the plywood door, it would hit the first column of rocks right behind it, causing the entire ceiling to cave in and pack the tunnel with dirt and rocks. Would someone dig 15 feet in to repair a wall? No. They would just fix the hole, retile it, and be done. And when they were gone, Hillary would probably just build another death trap exit. Like covering up an anthill with a rock, the ants would just make a new opening and go on about their business. He'd lived. He had survived. Aggie James walked down the tunnel, towards the light, towards freedom. Bryan had taken 280 off of 101 and followed it until it dumped out on King Street. That put most of San Francisco on his left, and on his right, AT&T Park, home of the Giants. He waved to the statue of Willie Mays at 3rd and King, watched the stadium go by, then turned right into 2nd Street. At the stadium, 2nd Street was little more than a service drive for the TV trucks and the beer trucks. At 11:30 at night, there were no trucks, only Sean Robertson's blue Ford. Bryan parked behind his car, got out, then walked up to the Ford and slid into the passenger seat.
All right, Sub-Chief, what's so all-fired important it couldn't wait? Your gun and your badge, Robertson said.
He didn't look at Bryan, just kept staring out the windshield.
What? Your gun, Robertson said, and your badge. Put them on the seat between us. Now.
What the fuck is this?
I know you broke into Erikson's house, Robertson said. Illegal entry. No warrant.
Bryan opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. Robertson kept his hands on the wheel. He still wouldn't look at Bryan.
Sub-Chief, look, man, there's some heavy shit going on and Pookie and I are close to figuring it all out. Don't do this. Just trust me. Now, Robertson said. You're suspended. I want you back in your apartment and you stay there until you hear from me. You got that? This stays quiet between you and me until the chief and I figure out what to do with you. Knowing her, this will go away and it won't appear on your record. But that's not going to happen if I have to call for backup, which I will do in the next 5 seconds if you don't give me your fucking gun and your fucking badge.
Bryan paused for a moment, then pulled out his Smith & Wesson 4006. He ejected the magazine, made sure the chamber was empty, then set the gun and the magazine on the seat between them. He then pulled his leather badge holder out of his pocket and put it on top of the gun.
And the C-Camp, Robertson said.
Fuck, Bryan said, before he could stop the word from slipping out. He didn't know how Robertson knew about the onion field gun, but clearly the guy paid close attention to his detectives.
You're not going to need it, Clauser, because you're going to be at your apartment, right?
Right, sir,
Bryan said. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out the leather wallet holding the tiny .32 caliber weapon. He set the whole rig, wallet and all, on top of the 4006 and his badge. A neat little pile of what had been both his authority and his force. Bryan Clauser hadn't been unarmed in years. Now all he had was the SOG Twitch XL knife in the forearm sheath. He wondered if Robertson would ask for that as well.
And I'm not kidding about your apartment, Robertson said. You stay right where I can find you.
Yes, sir.
Good. Now go home and stay put.
Bryan glared at Robertson for a couple seconds, but Robertson still refused to look at him. Bryan got out, then slammed the door behind him as hard as he could. Robertson didn't seem to notice. He put the Ford into a quick U-turn, then turned right onto Embarcadero, leaving an unarmed Bryan Clauser standing alone. Aggie James jogged along, moving at a good clip despite concentrating on remaining in the middle of the narrow space between the rightmost rail and the tile wall of the Muni Tunnel. He didn't know which rail was the third rail, the one that might electrocute him and the baby. It was probably the one in the middle, but he wasn't taking any chances. As he moved, the light from the station quickly filled the tunnel. Black tiles on the white tile wall spelled out Embarcadero Station. There were a few people up on the platform, a trash-littered white tile island between his track and the one on the far side. Maybe they wouldn't notice him. He carefully stepped over the tracks, his steps even more placed than those he put into Hillary's footprints back in the death trap. He crossed to the platform side of the tunnel, then moved with his back to the tunnel wall. He couldn't dick around all day, because he could already hear another train approaching. He inched up to the edge, his back to the wall, a large red and black ad for a book called Jack Wakes Up across the tracks, right across from the platform, so the people waiting for the next train wouldn't be able to miss it. He had to make his move. He still wore the stinking blanket. Homeless people wandered down to the subway all the time. People just got out of their way. All he had to do was hop up, walk straight to the escalator, and get out of there as fast as possible. That would take him to the station's main level, then one more escalator up to the surface, and he was home free. Then he could think about what he had to do next. The platform's yellow rubber edge came right up to his chest. He lifted the knit purse containing the baby and gently sat it on the platform, then scrambled up himself. People turned to look, saw what he was, then immediately turned away. Aggie rolled to his feet, stood, picked up the purse, and tucked it deep under the blanket. His heart hammered in his chest. He just couldn't believe he'd made it out. He forced himself to walk down the platform, not run, towards the escalator. Homeless people didn't run, mind you, and all he had to do was keep up the pretense and everyone would ignore him. Pretense. How odd to think of it that way. Wasn't he a homeless person after all? No, not anymore. Aggie James had spent his time in the gutter, feeling sorry for himself, feeling sorry for his losses. He'd given up, tuned out. He'd quit life, just didn't have the balls to do it right and jump off the Golden Gate Bridge like most of the other San Francisco suiciders. Well, that time was over. He was alive. He didn't deserve to be alive, but he was. His wife and his daughter were gone, and nothing could bring them back. It was time to be a man, to step up and get his life in order. He had a responsibility now, a responsibility to protect the child he held in his arms, to find this child a home.
Why don't you just raise the kid?
The thought popped into his head. No, that wasn't quite right. It hadn't just popped into his head. It had been there ever since he looked in the bag and saw the tiny black baby boy.
You were a parent once, a good parent. That robbery wasn't your fault. There was nothing you could do.
Aggie James stopped cold, just 5 feet from the escalator. It wasn't his fault. He realized, standing there stooped over in his reeking wreck of a blanket, smelling like something that had crawled out of a wet grave. He finally realized that it wasn't his fault. There was nothing he could have done to save his wife and daughter. He missed them with all his soul, but to put it in rather unpoetic terms, shit happens. Aggie James stepped forward and stood on the bottom escalator stair. And then the baby cried. It wasn't a soft cry. It wasn't a muffled, I just woke up cry. It was a full-blown, I am not happy at all cry. Loud and piercing. All heads on the platform, all the heads that had gone out of their way not to look at him, they all turned to look at Aggie on his way up the escalator. The baby screamed again. It wasn't anything unusual, really. Aggie James remembered being a daddy. He knew what to listen for. This was just a baby being a baby, but he knew what it looked like. A shabby bum with a screaming child hidden somewhere beneath a filthy blanket. A dozen people stood on the platform. Half of them pulled out cell phones, almost in unison, a chorus line of big brothers dialing 911. "Stop!" a woman on the platform yelled. Aggie James took off, his slipper-clad feet thumping out a silent drumbeat on the escalator steps. He felt hard shoes and sneakers pounding up right behind him. The first escalator took him up to the station's main floor. One more escalator, and he'd be out on the streets. "Get out of the way!" Aggie screamed. He ran hunched over, carrying the baby in both arms. His legs felt weak. He was already exhausted. "Stop him!" the men behind him screamed. Most people backed away because he still looked like a crazy bum, but one man, a kid, no more than 20, stepped in front of him. Aggie James tried a spin move. In his entire life, he had never tried a spin move. He'd never even played sports, for crying out loud, so why the hell would he have tried one now? If you asked him later why he did it, he wouldn't be able to tell you. Somewhere in his mind, in that split-second decision, he envisioned himself making a sweet spin move, leaving the 20-year-old grabbing empty air, and Aggie would shoot up the second escalator to the surface. His split-second vision and reality, however, were very different. Aggie tried the spin move, planting with his left toe. He twisted his hips to the right in a big circle, bringing his right foot around, where it landed on the end of his dangling blanket. The blanket slid across the polished floor, and his right foot shot out from under him, sliding backwards, sending him down fast face first. In the half second it took him to reach the ground, he managed to turn his left shoulder down and his right shoulder up to protect the baby. Aggie landed hard on his right shoulder, his weight and the spin momentum driving it into the unforgiving concrete tile floor. In the next 16th of a second, his head hit that same floor. It limply ricocheted off the hard surface, leaving behind a nice little bloody smear. By the time his head came back down, he was flat on his chest, bleeding profusely from a gash on his left temple, and he was quite unconscious. That is it for Nocturnal episode 23. As I told you in the beginning, I'll catch up with everybody really soon, fill you in on that unbelievable book tour, talk about all the unbelievable junkies who came out to support me. We packed every house, we sold tons of books, the publisher is thrilled, and we'll talk about how the book is doing as well. But for now, you got your episode, so I don't want to hear any bitching from all y'all junkies. Good God. See you next week. You have been listening to Nocturnal, written and performed by Scott Sigler. For more information, go to scottsigler.com. All music in this podcast provided by Uncrowned off their album Devils and Angels, available now at the iTunes Music Store.
Is it